Hi everybody, welcome to another Musing On. So, if you've been watching and listening to any of the Musing On episodes I've done in the past revolving around music, you'll probably know that what tends to happen is I research a year for a Musing On episode, or just, I say research, I re-listen to music from that year just to get my head around what I want to chat about. So I do the episode, and then whatever year I've picked, and in this instance, just to put a pin in it, I've been looking at 1997. So what usually happens is I do the episode, and then I think, I should talk about this band or this album, or maybe even this genre at some point. But what happened here was I haven't really finished looking through 1997, because there's tons to think about. There's tons to muse on about what was going on in that year, what was going on in my life, what was going on in terms of what I was listening to. There was quite a big sort of seismic shift in the sort of music I was listening to. And as a consequence, as I'm listening to albums, I started listening to this again after having not listened to it for a number of years. And to the point where it was getting so distracting that I thought, I've got to do like a Musing On, just to do a brain dump of this stuff so I can move on and look at the rest of 97. So this is how this has happened. So this is one of those instances where I'm going to do a companion Musing On episode for a year before I actually do the year. Yeah. And there was quite a few other bands as well that came up where I may end up doing that. So the 97 Musings On episode for albums from 97 could be a little while coming, because I've got a lot of music to listen to. So my listening sessions were drawn towards this band, or this album in particular actually, which came out in 97. So it's Apollo 440's Electro Glide In Blue. So the title's a reference to a 1973 American action film. I don't know if I've ever seen it actually. May have done. Named after the Harley Davidson electric guide motorcycle. I think way back I may have seen that when we were renting various videos from a local video store in the 80s. But there's lots of interesting things in this album that tie into when I get talking about in the 97 episode on albums when I do it. Without giving sort of too much away or talking about too many things or going down too many rabbit holes for that episode, there's some things I do want to mention. So firstly, what got me into Apollo 440 in the first place? Well, it was actually this track. Ain't Talking About Dub, and I'd heard it, and I was aware at that point it was one of those CD singles where they were releasing like multiple versions of the same thing. And so there were actually 2 CD singles out for this, and I ended up buying both. But that's as far as it went, and I didn't listen to the album in totality until a number of years later, probably on streaming services actually. But there's another interesting track on here, which is Stealth Mass in F sharp minor. And when I heard it for the first time in the context of the album, I thought, hang on, I know this track. And so now when I come to re-listen to it again, and I'm digging into Wikipedia articles, which forms the backbone of these episodes and helps me sort of try and at least bring my thoughts to some cohesion, it does mention that it was played several times on BBC Radio 1 on the 31st of August 1997. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this particular day because there's lots of interesting interconnections when I get to the 97 albums episode. But what I will say is, yes, I remember tuning in, having the radio on. I used to do this thing a lot where to help me sleep, I would often leave the radio on very low at night. And I woke up the next day after I'd left the radio on Radio 1, and there was just like music playing continually, including some sort of very ambient piece, and it was this. So when I listened to it again, that's why I recognise it. So this came out in 1997, and I didn't know much about Apollo 44 at the time. I found out a little bit more now. And the first thing when you listen back through to this album that you really notice, and I was sort of thinking about this morning when I knew I was going to record this video on my morning walk. And I've spoken before a lot in the 90s how through the sort of UK music lens, one thing that I've mentioned on several occasions is late 80s into the 90s, you had a lot of indie bands that were incorporating both dance element and electronic music and electronica into their sound. Bands like Apollo 440 to me sound like the reverse of that, where they're an electronic band that incorporates rock elements, some of that mainly through sampling. In the case of Ain't Talking About Dub, you probably know, and why it's credited here to, Van Halen, essentially, is that it's got a sample from Ain't Talking About Love in it, which has been messed around with. So at the time when indie bands were absorbing dance music and electronic music, electronic bands were experimenting heavily through sampling with rock music and dance music. And we'll come on to that a bit later, because Apollo 440 sounds has really evolved interestingly over time. Now, when you sort of look at the band and when they were formed, so formed in 1990, they've produced 5 studio albums, and they've notched up, 10 UK top 40 singles with 3 top 10s and a chart presence worldwide. The 440 reference, for those music buffs amongst you, will know that it's a reference to A440, and also the sequential circuits sampler sequencer, the Studio 440. And they've been involved with various remixes as well over the years, as is the case with a lot of electronic artists. So the core membership you can see here, these 3 people. There was an additional founder member, I suppose, 1990 to 93, and then, as is the case again with bands of this style of music, they have like a touring group for keyboards, bass, drums, vocals as well, that have been introduced at various points in their career. And you can see, actually, a number of these people are pretty long-standing. It's interesting, I'm looking to see, there is, so someone here does actually play guitars, because that's always interesting when you're having these sort of discussions about this style of band, are they using live guitars, are they using samples, are they using a combination of both, are they using like a keytar, that sort of thing. And it's quite fun when you listen to the music to sort of try and think, is that a sample? Or is that something else? And there's a lot. They often drop in soundtrack stuff as well. You might hear samples from films dropped in there. Like the opening track on the 5th album is called Stay Frosty. So that's off the album The Future's What It Used to Be, which came out in 2012. And there's the first track, Stay Frosty, where you can hear the sample in there. There's a little thing, sounds like it's from the Aliens film, Stay Frosty, where I'm trying to think the name of the trooper says it, but yeah. That's where it sounds like it's from. Of course, it could have been redone. I think I've spoken in the past how bands like 808 State would often redo what would have been a sample, and so rather than sample it, actually just redo it, so they don't have to worry about things like sample clearance, stuff like that. So you might run into other problems. So yeah, 5 albums. I've been working my way through. So I started here, went back, and then worked my way through. So at the moment, while I'm recording this, I'm actually listening to this album. You can hear a definite evolution of the sounds. These 3, in many ways, have, stylistically and the sort of guitar riffs they're pushing. There are a number of tracks on here which belong alongside, don't sound out of place alongside each other, even though they're recorded at different points in time. But mixed in amongst that, you get other stuff as well. So let's maybe just talk about individual things here. So before I do that, actually, let's just look at this, because this was also fascinating. A lot of their stuff has ended up in films, particularly the track Stop the Rock. You can see it's featured in a number of things. But then other stuff like Spawn bonus track. So there's a track on the Spawn soundtrack. I think I might have the Spawn soundtrack somewhere, actually. Yeah, Lost in Space, they did a theme to that, and we'll see what album that crops up on. Charlie's Angels, there was a remix of that. Yeah, so on. So yeah, so you can sometimes spot their music in certain films. So this is the first album, and genres that the boxes are ticked for: progressive house, trance, big beats, and electronic rock. And that's the first impression I get when I listen to it. I think of them alongside bands like The Prodigy. Now, admittedly, beat-wise, I always find The Prodigy to be a little bit heavier on the beat-wise of things, but at this point early on in their career, you can definitely see the electronic rock side of things with the guitar samples. And as I've said, those first 3 albums to me form a nice sort of group or cluster: drum and bass, electronic rock, big beats again. Now this track I really love. This is Electro Glide In Blue, and I was thinking about this again, well, actually twice. I mean, when I was out walking listening to it, and then again this morning as I was sort of reflecting on it, because I was listening to other tracks on other albums. And what's fascinating is, and I was trying to put my finger on it. So with some electronic bands, and Apollo 440 are a case in point, because of the samples they're using in their song structures, there's a real nostalgic feel to the music, even though it's, big beats underneath it all. The samples and their own sounds and their structures have that really sort of almost like spot the classic rock or funk or whatever refrain, and it just makes you want to go and listen to older records. And so Electro Glide In Blue has this lovely electric piano sound with, I think it must be chorus and echo and or delay on it, and it's just takes you away to where that sound was really prominent on. It's just a classic sound, in the same way as I have this thing about when I hear a guitar that's been fed through like a rotary speaker, and the guitar has been given that sort of Doppler effect. There's something about that as well, like lead sounds, or certain albums where artists have chosen to use certain instruments, and it evokes a real classic sound to it for lots of different reasons. I can think of albums like was it Spilt Milk by is it Jellyfish? I think that's the name of the band. But also other ones, like I remember when I listened to Pump by Aerosmith. They used a lot of different instruments on there, different types of guitars, and some of the sounds on there are real classic. And also, I got the same thing with the Black Album by Metallica when I listened to it the first time. I could hear things like Wishbone Ash in there, and stuff like that as well, things in the guitar sound. And so I get the same thing with Apollo 440 when I'm listening to. It's like a real nostalgic listen because of the stuff it absorbs into it. Now, it's really interesting to compare and contrast that with other electronic bands of this era, like someone like Chicane, who have a classic sound for different reasons. They created a sound, a sort of form of electronic music with sort of trance elements in it, which then became the almost like the de facto sound for other bands. And so this is going on, you know, all through the 90s and still today, I suppose, where you had bands that had pulled in influences and just had this wonderful sound that made you want to play old records. And then other bands established a sound which in itself then went on to launch a whole load of other bands. And that was all happening inside of, you know, electronic dance music, which is really interesting. So, yeah. That's certainly, whenever I listen to any of their albums, I get the impression, but some albums more than not, more than others. And as I've said probably several times now, you know, it's interesting to listen to these first three albums. The rock in there is strong on certain tracks, but then there's other style of music. There is a nice flow of music through there of different styles, different arrangements, different structures, because all the tracks have different elements of big beat, electronic rock, drum and bass, techno that are sort of moved in and out, if you like. So they, you know, one track might be a bit more techno than another. One track might be a bit more laid back than another. It may almost be to the point, I don't mention it, but stuff like trip, you know, I hear trip hop in the music as well. And that's, I think, how my ear became attuned to Apollo 440 is, you know, I was listening to trip hop, I was listening to drum and bass, I was listening to big beats. And here you've got a band that take those elements and pull in, you know, rock sampling and guitar sounds and stuff like that. Now, Prodigy, you know, went on to use guitar sounds. They have a live guitarist. But something about the way Apollo 440 do it, and also as you move through these albums, I was listening to a dude descending a staircase this morning, and there's a lot of really awesome funky stuff as well, which again has always been in the music. Yeah. In there as well. And it's still this sort of underpinning of big beat electronic rock, and here they've got trip hop instead of drum and bass. But yeah, I'd definitely say this album is a little bit more trip hoppy. Didn't do so well in some reviews by the look of things. And you can see, yeah, there's a lot of guest vocalists on their stuff, which really, again, adds to the diversity in the sound. I like it when bands can sort of do that. Yeah, laid back, trippy affair for the second disc. Yes, it's 2 discs actually for this one. What happened there? Don't know. Getting high on your own supply. Where did I go wrong here? There we go. So this is the 5th one, and this is what I'm listening to now. Electronic rock, breakbeat, drum and bass, and house. Yeah, you can definitely hear it on this album. There's definitely a movement from more of a, I suppose, an up front, big beat with rock sound on the earlier stuff, over to a bit more of a trip hoppy. Yeah, there's even a track on this do now called Odessa dubstep. Yeah, definitely a bit more laid back, but still really good. There's a Don't Fear the Reaper single as well, came out. They've done a number of singles here. Lost in Space is on the 3rd album, I think. So I thought I'd just go down a few little, short rabbit holes, just again to try and place the different genres on a musical timeline. So of course electronic music goes back, pretty long way, because people were experimenting with electronics in different ways. You got things like the theremin, and then we move on to experiments with recording equipment as well, tape music concrete, and then you move into sort of studio based electronics, and obviously use of electronics in classical music, certain people, and so on. I'm going to include links to all of these. So various countries were experimenting with creating sounds through electronic means, either totally or as an adjunct to something else. So maybe the tone was generated on a conventional musical instrument, and that was captured and then processed with electronic means. So then we sort of move, of course, into the era of synthesizers, and eventually into radiophonic workshop era, so using electronic music in soundtracks, people like reinterpreting classical music in synthesizers. Switch on Bach is a famous one. And then all through this you've got obviously a connection with computers being able to generate music, in addition to just something that uses electronics to generate music, but isn't necessarily from like a computer chip. And you can see that the background is quite a lot. So we're talking about lots of different places geographically and in terms of musical styles before we even get to talk about bands like Kraftwerk. It's pretty interesting. But there's also connections to German rock music, stuff like that, prog as well. So the whole electronic music area domain is enormous, and you get the whole synth pop thing as well. So great chasm to fall down. And we've got alternative music as well. So I suppose origins of that often trace back to Velvet Underground and Nico. And I think in the UK, I mean, the term indie was used a lot. And I'm trying to remember when the first indie chart appeared. But a lot of people, I think, like music commentators, also tie indie to bands like Buzzcocks. Yeah. In addition to sort of other post-punk bands. And, you know, alternative rock just went off on so many different genres and trends and whatever. And, you know, Britpop has its, you know, beginnings in the, you know, late 80s, early 90s. So that's going on all the time through that period as well. And as I've said, you know, a lot of bands in the UK, like 80s, early 90s, you're talking about rock bands that have pulled in dance and electronic influences, and bands like Apollo 440, almost like the flip of that. You know, you've got an electronic band seemingly that have pulled in rock music influences. And so a lot of that developed in parallel, I suppose, with the evolution of alternative rock. And you got Big Beat, which actually goes, according to us, back to the 60s. Yeah, so various people that you might recognise here, like Norman Cook. Other bands like Crystal Method. Death in Vegas is another band, actually. Propeller Heads. Yeah, Chemical Brothers. So there's a lot of 90s bands here. Prodigy. Yeah. Yeah. We definitely need to talk about the Crystal Method at some point as well. Drum and bass. Yeah. UK rave scene, apparently. So again, if we look at its sort of birth around here, it's all like tied in with house, techno, breakbeat, hardcore, rave, all sort of cross-pollinate, stuff like GABA as well, all these wonderful terms. Yeah, you can see, like, again, early ruminations in the 90s. And then trip hop. First appeared in print in 94. When they were talking about a single by DJ Shadow. And then it's a term that, Bristol Wild Bunch became associated with. Bristol sound. Massive Attack. Tricky. Yeah, Blue Lines, which I mentioned about when I did my 91 episode. Yeah. And so on. You got, you know, Bjork dabbling in it, and absorbed into various other bands. Dummy, really big mover on that whole trip hop scene. That's a really cool, tricky album. And then you got a number of other bands that I got into later, like Lamb as well. And I'm trying to think where Olive fit into the thing. I think they're more seen as a drum and bass band, actually. Yeah, so, yeah, really interesting internet connections and fascinating musical rabbit holes you can go down when you start exploring Apollo 440 and looking at their sort of musical influences. So I would thoroughly recommend checking them out on Spotify if you get the chance. And I definitely want to go back through and re-listen to some of this stuff again, actually, probably all of it. This is a really good album, actually. It's a shame it didn't do better. Yeah, I love this sort of stuff. The other thing I noticed, I was listening to actually this album, which they mentioned is got, what do they call it? So there's, as we went through this album, you'll see the term electronic rock get mentioned here and there. Some of the opening stuff does remind me a little bit of Pendulum, actually. Yeah. So, on that note, we might as well finish it up there. Thanks once again for watching and listening. And I will catch you in a future episode. Bye for now.